Hi, Emi Nietfeld. I'm so glad to have you here. You are the first memoirist we've had on How Writers Revise. I'm delighted to have you. I'm going to tell viewers a little bit about you. Emi Nietfeld is the author of the memoir Acceptance, a former foster youth. She graduated from Harvard in 2015 and worked as a software engineer at Google and Facebook. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, Vice, and Slate, been nominated for the Pushcart Prize, and noted in the Best American Essays. She lives in New York City with her family. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm thrilled to have you. I have a lot of readers and viewers who are very interested in memoir, who are writing it, love reading it, want to hear more about it. I particularly love yours because I'm reading it right now, I'm about a third of the way through. I love the way that you take really difficult, sensitive topics and make them accessible to the reader in the way that you write it. It's very unflinching, but it's also not, it doesn't feel like it's shock value to me. It's almost matter of fact. I mentioned to you a minute ago, to me, it feels like that writing adage that the hotter a scene, the colder you write it. And I think you're doing that really, really gives it a lot of impact. And it's an impactful story anyway. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah. Acceptance is my memoir through foster care and homelessness, all the time, obsessed with the Ivy League and going to college as my way out. Eventually I did get into Harvard and worked as a software engineer at Google and Facebook. But this book ended up also being a lot about resilience and some of the unrealistic expectations that we put on young people, especially who've gone through hard things, to be unaffected by what happened to them. And so it turned into this exploration of the cost of self-reliance in a society that really praises it.
Mm. I'm already seeing that start to develop. And I think that's part of the way that you wrote it. I think, again, brings that home, I think. I also love that because one of the things that we talk about with writers is that resilience is one of the qualities that you need most if you want to build and sustain a writing career. And we
Yeah.
kind of do the same thing with writers, which is, here's all the stuff working against you, but buck up. And keep going, and you're going to get 100 million rejections and very little money, but keep going. So before we sort of dive into your situation itself and the writing of it, can you talk a little bit about how the resilience messages that you got in your experiences, how did that echo the writing process and the publishing process, or
Mhm.
did it?
That's so interesting. What a good question. Growing up, I felt like I heard again and again, first from therapists and doctors, and then from people kind of representing admissions officers and these gatekeepers in charge. I heard that, you know, basically you are the only person who's responsible for not only your actions, but your feelings.
Mhm.
And that, like, literally, no matter what happened in my life, I had to just, move forward as though nothing bad had happened. And so, um, I think that there's really a spectrum with resilience, right? Where, of course, it's really helpful when bad things happen to be able to, or you get a rejection or something like that, to be able to move on from it and try again and keep trying and persevere. And so that's not exactly what I'm talking about in the book, but I think that that type of value can really be applied to some extreme situations, which I write about a lot.
Mm.
Um, but I think in the book, I write about my quest to get into college, where I was like, I'm not going to stop at anything, right? Like, no matter what happens, like, I will do everything in my power to go to an elite university. And the ironic thing is that, like, 13 years later, that's been the attitude that I've had towards writing this book. And
What
so
do you
that was
mean?
actually
Oh,
great. Yeah, yeah,
that
to be
that
like, nothing is going to
determination.
stop me. Exactly. And just to, you know, like, I had a lot of experience being rejected already and having just everything go wrong. And so I do think that was useful when I was writing the book, to be like, that's the way life is, that people like slam doors in your face, say no, 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 no. And that, like, this idea of having to just mine every possible connection, every webinar, every route. So that was kind of what shaped my publishing journey.
I'd love to follow that a little more, but first I want to talk about the actual writing of this. And one of the things that struck me about the book itself is that you clearly feel a drive for writing and did from the time you were young. Yes.
Definitely.
You had a lot of challenges in doing that. Maybe can you talk not only about, I don't want to put words in your mouth, some of those challenges, but also what made you push through them? Like, you do have this drive. It's clear in the book. It's clear with your wanting to publish this memoir. What makes that so important to you?
When I was growing up, I felt like I often just was completely unheard. And so both my parents have mental illnesses, and after my parents divorced and I was around 10, I moved in with my mom, who had hoarding disorder, and took me to these doctors to be medicated. And basically, I was telling adults in my life, like, this is what's going on at home, here are the problems, but it just all seemed to fall on deaf ears. And so to me, writing was really the way to tell my version of the story and try to trick people into listening, right? And not that I shouldn't be listened to, but there were versions of the story that were easier to accept, like the version that my mom was telling or that doctors were telling. And so I felt like I really had to become a skilled writer to convince people to take my perspective seriously.
But you weren't always writing memoir. You talked about a very highbrow literary novel that was the first thing you wrote. So how did that factor into it? Was that part of being heard, or was that imagination? Was this a drive you had?
I just wanted to be seen, and I wanted to have my like internal life be recognized and validated, ideally with the Pulitzer Prize, which I thought was pronounced the Pulitzer. But I did begin with writing, like I did some, a lot of like filling up the journals. My first book that I read about writing was Writing Down the Bones. Yeah, and it had
Up there
huge
on my
Oh,
number
really?
one shelf.
I love that. Yeah, it had such a big impact on me. And after a couple years of doing that, so between like the ages of like, I guess like when I was 13, that was my like Writing Down the Bones year. And then I did National Novel Writing Month in November. And I did that a few times throughout high school. And I think I turned to that because it felt really accessible to me. And because this community really rallied behind the idea of like, it doesn't have to be good, just get it done.
Yeah.
And I was like, I can do that. Like, I can grind.
You said you wanted to win a Pulitzer Prize. Was publication part of it? Like, did you think that was a viable option for you, or?
No, no. I mean, I dreamed about it, but like, I had a writing mentor for a little while. She was a poet. And I remember I asked her, like, how do you support yourself as a poet? And she had also been a chemical engineer. And what she told me is she was like, marry a rich man. And I was like, okay, so I'm not going to be writing any more poems in the near future, right?
I wish that were funny because it wasn't true.
Yeah, I know, right? And so, but she was publishing in lit mags and stuff, and I was really like, no, New York Times, like bestseller. But I didn't know that was just so completely like not the world that I was in at all. And so like it was, it would be like years and years, like even after I graduated college, to have like any grasp on how publication works.
So you worked at Facebook and Google, so you clearly are in a tech line of work and went into that, but you also went to a very exclusive art school. And I'm just at the part of the story now where you have switched over to writing or are about to. So you did seem like that was a direction you wanted to move in. Can you, because I'm not there yet, can you fill me and reader and viewers in on how did you get to Facebook and Google from the exclusive art school majoring in or studying writing?
So a little about my trajectory is that I left my mom's house shortly after I turned 14, and I spent a year in this locked facility for troubled teens. And there I really my dream of going to college really solidified, and I wrote as much as I could while I was there. And the next year I was in foster care, my sophomore year of high school. And from there, I got a scholarship to attend this arts boarding school called Interlochen in Michigan. And so I was a visual artist for 1 semester, and then for 3 semesters, I was a creative writing major, which was probably the most rigorous like creative writing education you can get in the United States, because we had a minimum of 3 hours a day of writing class.
Wow.
We had a 50-minute workshop every single day. And it was basically like every single day, like one person was workshopped for the 50 minutes by a bunch of teenagers, right? Like, can you imagine being workshopped by like fellow teenagers? And really you were just like trying to turn in a draft that was decent so that your peers wouldn't judge you and be like mean to you and socially ostracise you.
So like now.
Yeah, basically, except you lived with these people, like they were in your dorm, like you couldn't get away from them. So,
and were you writing like this kind of revealing stuff then, or was that fiction?
Well, so we were required to take poetry and fiction. So we alternated like poetry workshop, fiction workshop, which was, I think, being forced to do poetry as a young person. Like by then I was like, I don't care, I have no interest, but the teacher was a really harsh grader and I wanted to get an A. And her name is Anne-Marie Oman. She's like teaches at an MFA program now. And it's so interesting to be like, I'm going to go into poetry. I'm going to try to get an A, and to be like, wow, I can actually do that. Like, and I can actually like write these poems. I like what I learned there is in my head all the time. I can't recommend it enough. And so I did take a creative writing class when I got to Harvard. I took one, it scarred me a little bit. And
But that wasn't your intended major when you went?
No, no, it wasn't, because I was like, I need to have a job when I graduate. Yeah.
Also, I wish that weren't funny because it wasn't true.
Yeah. I mean, and I was like, a publishing job is not going to cut it. I was like, I need dental insurance. Like, I got to Harvard, and basically right away, I went to the dentist and I needed like $5,500 worth of work, which was like all my money I had. And I was like, I need someone else to pay for root canals in the future. So I studied computer science, and I really enjoyed it. And I think there's actually like enjoyed it is a strong word, but there is a lot of overlap with writing in certain ways. Like, it feels very painful. You never know if it's going to work. Like, you have to have like extreme like patience. And then when I graduated, I started working at Google. And basically shortly after I graduated, when I was at Google, I began writing acceptance. So that was 7 years ago.
Had you, during college, when you decided you needed this practical job, had you kind of given up on doing the writing or thinking about doing something professional with it? Was this just a practical decision, or were you still doing it?
Well, I had a non-writing mentor in high school who was a physician, and she had sat me down and told me, like, you cannot major in anything with French, English, or literature in the title. Like, if that is in the name of the major, like, you cannot study that. And it was very much coming from this like practical place. I went to high school during the Great Recession. I graduated in 2010. And so, yeah, so I think I kind of had this idea that if I studied, especially computer science, I would have the opportunity to write in addition to my day job, in a way that people who were, pursuing editorial jobs or marketing or journalism, that just kind of took all of their creative energy. And so I don't know how I got this idea into my head, but like, compared to finance and consulting, which is where a lot of people at Harvard went, software engineering was like the easy road. So I feel like I took the easy road. Yeah.
So
yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry. No. I did try to get onto the like Harvard literary magazine called The Advocate.
Mhm.
I did try to get on like 1.5 times, but then I just decided they're never going to take me. And so I didn't do it. And I kind of regretted that because I think I would have learned a little bit more about publishing. But there also was this freedom in feeling like I am not attached to any like establishment and I can kind of just do whatever I want.
And at that time, you said after you graduated and started working with Google, you started writing acceptance.
Mhm.
All along, had memoir been your intention at that point, or were you still writing fiction?
Yeah, I don't think I'd written any fiction since my high school workshop.
Wow.
Yeah. And part of it was that I took a memoir class in high school, and I found that that was really where I felt happiest and had the most success, frankly. And also, when I was applying to college, I felt like the process was so dehumanizing of
Mm.
having to take my life and package it into this one acceptable narrative for colleges that I really wanted to write about that process of, both what happened in high school and applying to college. And I thought about it all the time, like even through university and after I graduated. So when I sat down, I was like, I know exactly what I'm going to write.
I like that you bring up the idea of on a smaller scale from, I think, writing a whole memoir, but having to package your
Mhm.
life
Mhm.
for other people's expectations or the market or to make it
Yeah.
palatable. I think that's what memoirists struggle with. I hear that from
Yeah.
a lot of authors who
Mhm.
don't know how to take their experiences and make it saleable. And that
Yeah.
and that becomes a huge stumbling
Yeah.
block. So you're saying you felt freedom in being able to do that when you started writing your memoir. Did you struggle? I mean, there are some
Yeah.
real challenges with that, from
Yeah.
remembering and researching everything to the sensitivity issues, especially given what you're talking about. Did you
Yeah.
consider those things and how did you overcome them?
What a great question. I think in a big way, it was helpful to me to have that experience in high school of, here's the college application version of myself that I need to be.
Mhm.
And at the same time, I had this like creative writing stuff that I was doing where I was writing memoir and it was more like, here's what I want to say. And that had, I was kind of indoctrinated pretty young in like okay, things should make sense, right? Like if the reader doesn't get it, like the reader is kind of the person you're writing for, right? Because I would sit in these workshops and I would have my peers like pages and it would just be like I don't feel like you as the author had empathy for me as the reader and what my experience was going to be like. And so that was, I think, really useful when I sat down and was trying to package the story into a book to have kind of worked through some of those emotions, right? Around like,
Mhm.
I want to tell my story, I want to have my story be heard. And how does that intersect with like, these are the demands of the marketplace? And for me, like what that really, the way I was able to work through that was by allowing myself to write whatever felt the truest and often giving it to someone and asking them to read it. And
Someone outside of your of the story.
someone outside of the story, like my college rowing coach actually read like some of my very first drafts. Yeah. And it was just really important to me to be able to, write the kind of unedited, like unpackaged story and have someone tell me, like, you are a good person and I love you. And because for like that was when I was able to be like, okay, I told this, like I've been heard, and now I can take it to the next level in terms of craft and everything like that.
How did you navigate? Because I
Mhm.
mean, you talk about your mother and your
Mhm.
both your parents'
Yeah.
situations, and both are fair. You said they both suffer from mental illness. Your father transitioned and is
Mhm.
now female. Um, how did you deal with? Did you consult them about, like a lot of writers that I talk to worry
Yeah.
about hurting feelings,
Yeah.
burning bridges? Was that a concern for you? And if so, how did you navigate it? And if not, why not? Telling someone else's story that is a part of your story, I guess.
Yeah, that was definitely something I thought about a lot. My mentor, Annette, who's in the book, when she heard that I was writing well, first she told me, don't do it. You're going to destroy your life. Like, absolutely don't do it. And then she's like, if you're going to do it, like, you need to have all your facts straight because your mom is going to disagree. And my mom has a very good memory for many, many things. But so I did interview her as part of this process. And, I had thought that if I just talked to her, that there would be like a version of my story that we both agreed on, and that we both could, that we could find this middle ground, and that could be like our reality from which our relationship, happened. And I very quickly found that that was not going to be the case. And that there were certain questions like, I asked her about this family therapy session that happens very early on in acceptance and is one of the catalysts for everything that happens after. And she said with complete conviction, like, that never happened. Like, we never went to family therapy when you were at this hospital. And I was like, I swear, like, that we did. And I ended up like racking my brain for weeks before I tracked down the billing receipts from my health insurance company from
Wow.
from like 15 years prior. And like my mom still was like, that didn't happen. And so I had to kind of pivot and look at it from a different angle of like, okay, she is not going to agree. We are not going to be able to find this like middle ground. And so what I did was I tried to focus on being as factually accurate as possible. Like, I read over 10,000 emails that I wrote in high school.
Wow.
It was like no stone left unturned. That was my research motto in this book. And I think being really judicious about what information I divulged about both of my parents, and protecting their anonymity wherever possible, like through pseudonyms, and then I didn't change details, but I did omit details when it would be too identifiable. And then finally, just from really like owning, okay, this is my perspective, right? Like, the book is very much written from like a singular point of view, and that I am not trying to give anyone else's perspective. It's really like, okay, this is my story, and kind of acknowledging that some of the people in it will disagree.
That's a hard balance to strike because it is your story to tell. And yet, I'm sure it sounds like already from your mom, you got a lot of pushback from people who did not want you to tell it the way that you remember it.
Yeah.
Was that part of the challenge in writing it?
Yeah, I think so. I went through every bad situation that could happen. Like, people could sue me, people could be upset, like that my dearest friends could never talk to me again. And for me, the biggest way to manage that was to feel like I was trying to talk about something that was larger than myself and larger than my own story, and that would make that there was a reason behind it and something bigger that I was trying to do. And so that, even if people's feelings were hurt, that it was really for a reason.
So did any of those things happen after publication?
Honestly, it's been a lot better than I thought. I did give the book to a number of people. I one person who's kind of a hero in the book initially really didn't like it when she read a draft like 4 years ago. Yeah, but then she actually read it when it came out again, and she's like, good job. Like, you did a great job over the last 4 years of editing.
I think it takes so much courage and vision to have, like you say, she didn't like it when she read it, and then when it was published. So you were like, I'm sorry you don't like it. I'm going ahead anyway. I think that's one of the biggest challenges of writing memoir, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really, especially when you come from a background, as I think many memoirists do, where you feel like your reality is something that's up for debate, or you feel like you have been silenced. it's really hard to then be like, okay, I love you. You did so much for me. You hate this, and I'm still gonna do it, you know?
It's kind of lucky that in our modern society, you did have like this email trail. I think that
Yeah. Oh,
like
yeah.
the idea
I,
that you made this really research based, I think probably helped.
yeah, definitely. And I I feel so grateful that I was coming of age when it was like just all my communication was via email and sometimes via instant messages, which I also had in my inbox. Um, so
That's
that
crazy.
was really great. Yeah, and
Did you
it's
correlate any of your version of things with other people besides the people directly, like people who would have known about this,
yeah.
family therapy or other things you were going through, friends of yours? Did you corroborate things?
Yeah, I interviewed basically everyone who seemed at all relevant. The way I did it was I made a spreadsheet like with the dates and then like links to stuff and then quotes. And so like as I was going through the medical records and as I was going through the emails, I would just like add the relevant entries there.
Okay.
Um and then like
That's a
yeah, and
super computer sciencey nerdy way to do this, by
oh
the
my
way, which
gosh,
I love.
no, but my spreadsheet had like hundreds, maybe
Oh
thousands
my
of
God.
cells in it. And so, and I wish I had been really organized about it. I probably sound very organized, but I actually didn't do that part of this until I was like 4 years in. And so yeah, and so I wrote the like, and this is something I'm thinking about as I'm considering new projects, right? Like at what point do you do the research?
Hmm.
And for me, I feel like I've always done the research kind of when it became urgent to do so. And so yeah, because it's like I wanted to write
That
the
makes
book
sense.
just based on my memory, right? So the first drafts are completely based on my memory. And as I was looking through the emails and stuff, I was honestly pretty shocked by how accurate my recollection of like quotes and stuff was. And the main thing that I found, and I'm really curious if some of your like readers and viewers find this in their own lives, is that I it wasn't that I got things wrong, it was that I forgot things.
Mm.
And so after like for example, after I applied to college, I felt a lot of guilt. But I couldn't explain why. I couldn't remember why. On the page it didn't make sense. And then it was going through these emails that I remembered that I had rewritten my college applications to remove any reference to mental health struggles. Yeah. And including like omitting an entire year in like a locked facility.
Wow.
Yeah, and I had forgotten that I made that huge change on my college applications. But then I saw the email and I was like, oh, I remember exactly how this
That's so
happened.
lucky. I think it's so hard. One thing I hear from a lot of
Yeah.
writers is how hard it is to accurately remember everything, especially when
Yeah.
there's hurt feelings and all involved.
Yeah.
The other thing I hear a lot, and I'm curious about it because I like the way that you structured this story. You start with not where you are now, but where you are a few years ago, I guess, when you were writing it, and on the verge, you were engaged and your parents were meeting his parents. And then you go back and basically tell it chronologically, at least to where I am at this point. I'm not sure if you
Yeah.
continue that. Did you have to did you always intend to do that? Or did you think about how to structure it? One thing I hear authors say is, how do I take what is just life, which is not always a nice, neat narrative package, and turn it into something that does work as a narrative structure?
That's a great question. My very first drafts were not chronological. It was just, I mean, my very first draft was really like, how do you say that word? Like the structure of my mind, right? Where you're like
Like
just
stream
dumping
of
it.
consciousness, kind of?
Yes, there you go. There you go. Stream of consciousness. So, that was my very first draft, and it was a lot of like, oh, I'm looking back, like this is what made me think of that. And I love reading books with writers who can like move through stories that way. And it very quickly became clear to me that I could not, not for the story. Like it was just there were too many moving parts and it had like a clear not it had a like a clear narrative arc in that I had a desire, I pursued that desire, like, and then I got the desire and then other things happened. And I have always my biggest struggle has been making sense as a writer that
You
people in high school
do
would
you
just
mean with the prose itself, like how you tell the
yeah,
story?
exactly. And just like being confusing and like what's happening when. And um and so that the chronological structure was really helpful for doing that. And I also happen to really like memoirs that read like novels.
Mm. Which yours
I
does, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, because I was basically like, okay, if this is a novel, how would I, how would I write it? And I basically approached it that way. And then the the intro, which is more of like a present day situation, that was kind of a concession actually to the memoir structure, where memoirs typically do begin with this like more present day, introduction. And I also heard from readers that it was like basically too painful for them to just go through this journey with me if they didn't know it ended up okay.
I can see that actually.
Yeah.
But also to me, it raised, just from a purely story nerd point of view, it raised a question right away, which is, how do you get from here? How do you get here from there? And
Yeah.
that to me was a great hook for the whole story. That's why I thought it was especially effective.
Thank
It's
you
a
so much.
suspense hook, right? Which is
Yeah.
like, I like what you said about, you have to use novel fiction principles
Mhm.
to make something as readable as what fiction is, because there are certain story elements that make a story effective for readers. How did you find those things? So you talked about this intro was sort of a concession to the specs of the genre, but you, like, what do you, when you say you structured it like a novel, what do you mean? Like, you looked for the high points and the low points and the climax and a thread of through line of the theme? Is that the kind of thing you're talking about? Not to get too nerdy, but that's what we do here.
So back in 2018, I was on, I think like my sixth draft, I
Ooh.
would say. I'd been working on it for 3 years. Oh, I did more than like 30 drafts for this. So I gave it to a friend's mom who is a writer herself, and she wrote me a really kind note and was basically like, okay, this needs more structure. And she recommended a book to me called Blueprint Your Bestseller. Um, and it was, I would say it's more geared towards like genre fiction writers,
Okay.
but it was very much like, here are the like here is how themes like fit together to make like one coherent point in a story. And it also, one of the theses of this book is like a novel is built on scenes.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the exercises it had you do was basically go through and throw away anything that wasn't a scene. And like,
That's smart. It gets rid of a lot of exposition, which is
it gets rid of, yeah,
which is
exactly.
the stumbling block with a lot of memoir.
Yeah, and it maybe took, so I did that. I was able to revise the book in 1 month of full time. Yeah, I had a month off from work and I did like a complete revision in that month using the steps, and I cut it down by like 40%. It was like
Wow.
400 pages and then it was like mid
Wow.
words. Yeah, and the difference was radical because I before that um I had to beg people to read it. Like, please read this, please give me feedback. And after that, I would give it to people and they would basically read it like straight through in one shot. And I'm not a big consumer of genre fiction, but I do think that the like principles and the structure were very, very useful to me in the editing process and in really like thinking about and kind of accepting that there are certain conventions that as readers, as typically as most of my audience is like American readers, we have an expectation when we open a book about what is going to happen when. And I actually went and I looked at like 10 best-selling memoirs to be like, do they follow this hero's journey structure?
Mm-hmm.
And do the beats happen when, these people prescribe that they're supposed to happen? And they all did,
Yeah.
like down to the page, right? And so I think it's just that, and I think when I was younger, I would have like really fought against that. And I mean, I think there's amazing writers who are not doing that. But I think for me, it was useful to be like, okay, what happens if I just try that? Like it was already a challenging book. I'm like, let me just see what happens. And I think it worked really well for me and allowed me to have like the space and the freedom to get into like the scene writing, like driving the message home, really like making it feel philosophically like there was something behind the book.
But also very vivid and immediate and accessible
Thank
to
you.
me.
Yeah.
Okay, you're being very generous with your time, and I don't want to keep you too long, but usually we talk a little bit about the publishing journey in this
Yeah.
feature. Did you already have publishing contacts or something lined up because of your story, or what was your publication journey like?
Yeah. When I was in high school, I did talk to an agent, and it was so clear that I was not ready to publish a book about anything at that point. So as like a young adult, you know, I had someone who offered to put me in touch with her agent, but there were a lot of like strings attached, and I kept like revising it so that she would feel good about sending it in, and it was not getting there. And so I turned to advice on the internet and I started querying. And I queried after working on the book for like a year, I think I started. And I queried probably
With it,
over,
did you have a proposal, like a formal proposal at this point?
I had a
All worked
manuscript.
up? Okay. Okay.
Yeah. And so I ended up selling the book on manuscript.
Okay.
And so I feel like there's so much like that's like one of the biggest questions memoirists have is like, should I write the whole book or should I write it on proposal?
Mhm.
And personally, for me as a first-time memoirist, I don't think I could have sold the book on proposal because I didn't have a platform. And I also am really glad I did not try because I thought, you know, okay, I'm ready to go 1 year in. And it ended up being like 5 years, more than 5 years before I sold it. And I'm really glad that I had that time because it would have been a completely different book. And I think I wouldn't be happy standing behind the message that I would have sold like 6 years ago.
It also puts a
Um,
lot of pressure on you to
yeah.
write it that
Oh,
way, I
yeah.
think.
Yeah.
And
And
it sounds like you wanted some freedom to find out what it wanted to be.
exactly. I mean, I would have, if you had like given me the choice back then, I would have loved to like just to sell the book early. Um, but I do feel like as a reader, like sometimes I can tell when a manuscript was written on proposal, you know, because it's like you sell the book on proposal and you have like 1 year to deliver it, right? And I feel like I spent more than a year just writing the epilogue, right? So but I mean I also had a, you know, I had a day job throughout this process. And so I queried like roughly 100 agents, and I would go to like readings and stuff, and I would just literally try to meet people. Like, and eventually I met someone who was like, you need to start publishing essays. And so I started taking classes on like essay writing and submitting to the slush piles. And basically what happened for me was I got a lot of manuscript requests. I did not get any offers. But I did have someone at an agency who read it and was like, I really like this. We don't represent like non-researched memoir. Would you consider adding research? And so I went ahead. I spent like the next like 6 months trying to add research.
What do you mean by that?
I think that what she meant, what I interpreted that as what she meant was like making it be like a book where you're
This is what the
like
foster care system is like?
exactly,
Okay.
exactly. And so I kind of really failed at that. I sent her something, didn't hear anything. I took that out and then I just edited it more. And then I sent it back like a year after the first contact. And she had left the agency, but she had gone on to become an editor at Penguin Press. And so the person who replaced her at the agency forwarded it to her. And then she's like, let's get coffee. And yeah. And
That's
so,
all right.
yeah, that was fine. And that was back in 2018.
Okay.
And at the time, I was really dead set on like this book starts at high school, starts at the beginning of high school, and it ends at the end of high school. Like after I've gotten to Harvard, but I'm not going to show you Harvard on the page. And I had reasons for that because there are complications that happen, things that I felt like I could not write about. And I felt like the point that I had, it was totally different if you went included Harvard. And so basically I met with her and she was like, you have to include Harvard. Like, you're not going to sell this book unless you talk about Harvard. And luckily I felt safe enough with her right away that I told her, like, look, this is why I can't do it. And she told me, she's like, write that. What you just told me, what
Mm.
you can't do, just write it and send it to me. And so, like, for the next like few years, she would be emailing me like every 6 months to be like, hey, where's the book? Send
But
me the
she
book.
hadn't offered anything at this point, right? This was just encouragement. Yeah.
Yeah. And she had been like, I did write about Harvard and she's like, this is pretty good. Like, we'll do another draft and then maybe we'll see if we can buy it. And then at that point I got a concussion and like a pretty bad concussion. And then people in my life were like, you have to have an agent. Like, don't be talking to an editor if you don't have an agent. And so basically, like, we were in touch. And then in 2020, I did get an agent. Early 2021, my agent sent it to this editor and then she bought it. And she's
Ah,
my
that's
editor.
nice.
And I love, like, it's just, like, we both, like, cannot believe it worked out. And she's just, like, the best editor in the world. I'm sorry that was a very long-winded story, but
I
it
think
often
that's
feels,
what I think that's what fascinates authors is because
yeah.
it's a business of relationships.
Yeah, definitely. And it is like easier to be in New York, which is where I live
Mm.
now. Um I will say that even though, I met great people like on Twitter, like I don't really think I grasped how much I could learn from other writers and how important those relationships would be, like not just in like getting an agent or selling the book, but in publishing the book, in promoting the book. And also just like some of my best friends are from this writing community.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think community is so important, especially for writers where so much of it is isolating.
Yeah.
And so much of it is, my husband laughs because he's like, one day the thing that you wrote is the worst thing that's ever existed. And the next day you're thrilled with it. I'm like, yeah, that's what
I
writing
love that.
is.
Yeah.
But you need people who understand that the thing is
Yeah.
awful and terrible and wonderful and sublime,
Yeah.
often the exact same thing on just different times of your life,
Yeah.
and support you through the down times, which are tough. And you
Yeah.
do learn so much, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, last question. And
Yes.
thank you for your time and generosity and openness. And this is just so enlightening, I think, for those who want to write memoir. So that leads me to the next question that I think I hear a lot from authors, which is, you have written the memoir now to this, close to this point in your life. You like to write memoir. You would like to continue, I presume, to stay in this genre. What do you write about next? Like, do you have something in mind? How do you see your career going forward?
Yeah. I I think I assumed that the book would come out and I would be promoting it for like 2 weeks before, 2 weeks after, and then it would be time to focus on the next thing. And what is really surprising to me is just how I need to stick with it. So right now I'm very focused on acceptance and on writing essays, publishing essays. And I I feel like from memoir, like there I think it's really hard to follow up one like straightforward memoir with another straightforward memoir. And to me that doesn't feel very exciting. And so what I have seen as the two options are like writing a novel
Hmm.
or going into something that's more researched and more reported. And so that's the direction that I hope to go into, and kind of flex those muscles, learn how to incorporate history and criticism in a way that's more direct than in acceptance, where it's all kind of under the surface.
Okay.
So that's where I hope you can find me.
Where else can we find you? People who would like to connect with you or see more of your work.
Yes, I am on social media, especially Twitter at Emi Nietfeld, my first name, last name. And I'm also at emineetfeld.com, where you can sign up for my newsletter, which is just once a month. Some writing stuff, fun life recommendations. It's a good place to be.
And I'll also mention that over on my blog, foxprinteditorial.com, Emmy has been kind enough to allow us to give away a copy of Acceptance. So surf on over there if you are seeing this somewhere near the beginning of October of 22 and enter to win that. Thank you, Emmy, this is just, I'm loving the book, and talking to you is an extension of that, which tells me again that this is such an authentic, straightforward voice, which is something I'm finding really appealing about it. So thanks for that.
Thank you so much. It was so great to talk to you, Tiffany.
Good luck.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Take care.